is Clara West, and she actually passed away. She went to heaven in February of 2020. And the last time I saw her was when Andy and I had an opportunity to go on a cruise, and she was on that cruise. She was in a wheelchair, and she was recovering, and she said really that the prognosis of her situation wasn't good, but she was happy for all the years that she has, and she was going to trust the Lord for whatever he had for her. But she's just a sweet gal, and her son wrote a little essay about her and wanted to respond or share her life with other people. And I know Clara enough that I knew a lot of these details. She had been a missionary all of her life. From the time she and her husband got married, they served as missionaries with the Wesleyan Church, and most of the time was in Peru. And that's how I remember Rick and Clara were serving in Peru while I was in Africa. And Rick and Clara were serving in Peru when I was in Russia. They were just in Peru for a long time. She was so good about welcoming small groups or the short-term mission teams when they came, made them feel welcome. And then after they'd been in Peru for a while, they went to Costa Rica for a little bit. Costa Rica is where a lot of missionaries go to learn Spanish, and the people who met them there said it was so wonderful to have them there because they were such great mentors and things like that. And then after that, they came back to the United States and lived in Florida for a while, supposedly kind of retired and still helping out with missions once in a while. But since the time she was little, the reason why she wanted to be a missionary was that she had a friend who was from Cuba who taught her to speak Spanish. And she said, I want to be a missionary to Cuba. Well, she went to Peru, and she went to Costa Rica, and she went to Florida, where they speak Spanish, but she had never gotten a chance to go to Cuba. During their retirement, she was able to make several trips to Cuba and to minister to the church there in Cuba. At one point, they took 13 pieces of luggage, suitcases with them to take things to the people of Cuba. Just 2 suitcases is all I can handle, so I don't know how in the world they did 13. God blessed them with 4 children, and they all got married, and now they have 11 grandchildren. And this young man that's writing about his mom just said, Mom was always selfless. She was always caring. She loved everybody equally, and she treated everybody the same. He says that oftentimes she would tell people, I'm praying for you, and then she'd stop and pray for them right then and there. And they knew that she really meant it when she said she was going to pray for them. I like what he says here. She knew when to turn the cheek and when to overthrow the tables. So she just had a good sense of humor, he said. But the interesting thing is, as she was getting close to death, one of the things she said and asked is, did she love enough? Did she give enough? Did she comfort enough? Did she do enough? I think that's what all of us wonder, don't we? Have we done all that we can? And this message is specifically to moms, and you can put grandma on there, or aunt, or whatever your role is with children. But I'm speaking specifically to women. Guys, I think some of this will apply to you too, so you might want to listen up. But I want to show you some really good examples from the Bible about how we can be as mothers. To start out with Rachel. We find the story of Rachel in Genesis chapter 30. And I'm not even going to read any scripture today. I'm just going to tell you the stories because you know these stories. But I want to remind you about Rachel. Rachel had waited a long time to finally get to marry her husband. If you remember the story, Jacob loved Rachel and wanted to marry Rachel. But his father-in-law wasn't really keen on the younger daughter getting married before the oldest daughter. And I got the impression that Leah wasn't real pretty and Rachel was. And so it's like, I gotta get this girl married off somehow. So Jacob was told by his father-in-law, you work for me for 7 years, and at the end of the 7 years, I'll give you Rachel. Well, then he did an old switcheroo after the wedding and put Leah Rachel, and he found that he had married Leah. He was not happy. And he says, I want Rachel. He says, okay, work another 7 years. Now, I don't know about any of you others, but I don't know of any man who wait 14 years for their lives. But that's what Jacob did. He waited 14 years, and he finally was able to marry Rachel. The hard thing for Rachel, though, was that Leah kept having babies, and Rachel didn't have any. And her heart was broken, and she begged God for a child. In fact, she came up with this plan that she had heard about her grandmother-in-law, Sarah, had done. It's like, just sleep with the concubine, and we can have a child together that way. Well, that didn't fulfill what she wanted. She wanted a child herself. And she prayed, until finally God did grant her a child. And it was Joseph. And she loved Joseph. And I imagine her relationship with Joseph, she probably spent a lot of time with him because this was her only son, and Leah had plenty of kids. She was busy with her kids. But Rachel spent time with Joseph. And she loved on Joseph. And she told him, when he started talking about dreams, I bet she said, oh, you're a dreamer. Keep dreaming, my boy. Keep dreaming. Because Rachel understood that God had a purpose for Joseph. We need to pray as mothers that our children find God's purpose for their life. I imagine when she was sitting there with him when he was just a young boy, she sang that song, I am a promise, I am a possibility, I am a promise, with a capital B and P and a great big bundle of potentiality. And I won't bother you anymore with that horrible singing, but I bet that's what she sang to him. She's just encouraged him. God has a purpose for you, Joseph. He loves you and he wants you to do some great things. She had no idea. Because years later, she was able to have a child, Benjamin, and she never saw that purpose that God had for Joseph because she died giving birth to Benjamin. But what happened is Joseph's dreams got his older brothers upset, and they decided to get rid of Joseph, and they sold him into slavery, and he ended up in Egypt, and things didn't go so well. And I could tell you the whole long story, but what happened is Joseph ended up being second to the Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. Amazing. And because he was there at the right time, in the right place, he was able to help Egypt keep from starving, because one of his dreams revealed that God was going to bring a famine, and he was able to help them store up grain. So when Jacob and his brothers back home started running out of food, they came to Egypt looking for food and found Joseph. And Joseph was able to save his family because God had a purpose for Joseph. Rachel didn't get to see that, but she knew that. And she poured that into him. She encouraged him to dream big dreams. The next mother that I see is Jochebed. Now, if I don't tell you who Jochebed is, how many of you even know who Jochebed's son was? Yes. Yay! The two of us know that. Yeah, Jochebed was Moses' mother, and so we're looking in Exodus for that story, and you know that story. I was hoping there'd be some little ones, and we were going to do the little story about Moses. But at the time that Moses was born, the Pharaoh, again, in Egypt, is not happy that there are so many Israelites living in his land, and he has turned against them, and he's turned them into slaves. And he's making them do all the hard work, and they're getting stronger and stronger and more powerful all the time. So he says, well, let's just get rid of the men. And so he's decided to have all the boy babies to be killed. He wanted them dead. And so he told the midwives, kill the babies when they're born, especially when they're boys. Kill them, don't let them live. We got to stop this. Well, Jochebed knew that the child she was carrying was from God. And God wanted that child to live. God had a purpose for that little boy. So she did all that she could to save that child. She put him in a basket. She put him in the Nile River every single day. And his sister stayed by watching and making sure he was okay. And along came Pharaoh's daughter and saw that baby floating in the river and said, I want that child. And fortunately, Moses' older sister was there right at the right time to say, I know somebody who can take care of that baby. So Jochebed ended up being able to continually take care of her baby boy. Probably 3 to 5 years, because they oftentimes fed their babies for multiple years. So maybe 3 to 5 years she was with that boy every day, caring for him. And I don't think that's all she did. I believe she spoke God's truth to him. In fact, she may have sung a song like this. If you've got pain, he's a pain taker. If you feel lost, he's a way maker. If you need freedom or saving, he's a prisoner shaking savior. If you've got chains, he's a chain breaker. Because she knew that if Moses would put his faith in God and not the gods that his adoptive mother was worshiping, that God would help him free the people of Israel. I see that Jochebed put faith into her children, and we as mothers and grandmothers can also pray for faith to be poured into our children. Another song she might have sung was, I'll send an army to find you in the middle of the darkness, and when the night is through, I will rescue you. And she let Moses know that God was going to rescue the people of Israel. And we know from his story that God, Jehovah, met with him personally and said, you are the one who is going to lead the people of Israel from their captives. You are going to help rescue them. So we can put that kind of faith into our children too, to trust God no matter what, even when things are difficult. And then in 1 Samuel, we find another mother. Elkanah had 2 wives. Same situation like Rachel was faced with. He loved Hannah, though, the most. But Hannah had no children. And every year she cried and cried for children. She wanted and desired children. In fact, that other wife kept nagging her and giving her a hard time. I have 3 kids, 3 sons. I have 2 daughters. I don't know how many it was. I don't have that written here. But she would just brag about how many sons and daughters she had. In fact, every year they would go to the temple and they would bring their sacrifices to the temple. And Elkanah would actually give the exact portion to Peninnah and say, this is for you and for your children. This is exactly what you need. But when it came to Hannah, he would say, here's a double portion. Let's look for God's blessing. Here's a double portion for you to go and ask. And so while she was praying one particular year, she was really pouring out her heart, and she was weeping and crying. And guys, you know how we can weep and wail, right? You've seen it. But that's what was happening with Hannah, because her heart was broken. This other wife was harassing her and giving her a hard time. And it's like, God, why don't you hear my prayer? And Eli, the priest, comes by and he says, Woman, why are you drinking? It's like, I'm not drinking. I'm pouring my heart out to God. I want so much to have a child, and God hasn't given me a child. And his response was, well, God's going to hear your prayer, and he's going to grant you what you want. But, even before she prayed that prayer, this is the amazing part to me. I think it's important that we dedicate our children to God. But Hannah dedicated her child to God before he was conceived. He said, Lord, if you just give me a child, that child will be yours. That child will serve you in the temple. That child will be there for you in any way that you want. I will give that child to you. Just give me a child. She went home. She made love with her husband. They had a child. And Samuel was born. And she knew what she needed to do, so she took that little baby Samuel to the temple and said, Eli, this child belongs to the temple. Well, now Eli couldn't take care of that child when he was little, so he says, well, you take care of that child, you nurse that child, and you bring it up, and then when it's old enough, you bring Samuel back. And that's what she did. He was probably, again, with Hannah, probably 3 to 5 years. And do you think she wasted that time? No. She made sure that Samuel knew that God had a purpose for him. And she made sure that Samuel understood that he needed to have faith in God. But one of the most remembered things about Samuel, and I believe that Hannah had something to do with this, was she made sure that Samuel understood that he needed to listen for God's voice. And let me tell you why that was really particularly important with Samuel. He was being raised now from the time he was 5 and older by Eli. Eli was taking care of him. Eli wasn't really the best example of a good priest. In fact, if you look at his children, they turned out horrible. I don't even want to talk about the kind of things they were doing outside the temple, and they were supposed to be priests themselves. And even Eli himself, instead of taking the meat that was offered for the sacrifices, instead of cutting off the fat, he made sure the fat stayed there because he liked fat. In fact, I've heard a lot of people say that Eli himself was fat, and so were his sons. They weren't obedient to God. They weren't being godly priests. So I don't know what kind of things Eli was telling him, but Hannah taught him to listen for God's voice. Maybe she sang to him, I am thine, O Lord. I have heard thy voice, and I told of thy love for me, but I long to rise in the arms of faith and be closer drawn to thee. So from the time that Samuel was little, he learned to listen for God's voice. Then in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 21, it tells us that Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. Okay, that didn't come from living in the temple with Eli. I'm just going to tell you. Because I have to even think about the fact that when my boys were about pre-adolescent and they started disobeying me and causing me trouble, I thought if I could just send them off to a monastery or something, maybe they would finally be good boys. You know, we could just send them off to a good Christian school. In fact, don't we do all that? We try as much as we can to make sure our kids get a good, solid foundation. We bring them to church. If they're Sunday school, we make sure they go to Sunday school, to youth activities, vacation Bible school. You know, I told you I went to 4 or 5 during the summer because my mom wanted to get rid of us. But it was fun, though, to learn those things. Maybe we even send them off to a Christian boarding school. We want to do all that we can. But Hannah understood that it wasn't somebody else's job. She needed to make sure that her son lived in God's presence. We need to pray that our children live in the presence of the Lord. And because Samuel had learned how to listen for God's voice, he also learned how to live in the presence of the Lord, even in that setting that wasn't so great. Samuel went on to become a great leader in Israel. He was a great prophet. He was the one that helped the nation bring in their first king. And then when that first king messed up, he was the one that was able to go and anoint King David. Samuel did great things. We can't ask our universities, our daycares, our schools, them to help our children be in God's presence. In fact, it's just the opposite happening, isn't it? Even in preschools anymore, the things that they're learning. So for all those reasons, we have to pray that we can be a godly example to our children in our lifestyles, so that when they're away from us, they will hold on to the things that we want them to hold on to. So, like Rachel, pray that your children and grandchildren find God's purpose for their life. Pray for that specifically. Encourage them that God does have a purpose for them. And like Jochebed, pray for faith to be poured into your children. And do all you can to pour faith into them. Like Hannah, pray that your children will listen for God's voice and that they will live in the presence of the Lord, even when they're out in the world. Like I said, Rachel died in childbirth for her second child, and she never did see what Joseph did. She never saw what God's purpose was for Joseph, but she made sure that Joseph knew that. Hannah was blessed with 3 more sons and 2 more daughters, even after she let go of Samuel. And Jochebed, most likely, I can't prove this scripturally, either died there in Egypt or possibly went with her son when they were rescued from Egypt. But she knew what she did was the right thing, pouring faith into Moses. That's the job and the responsibility we have as mothers. I want to close here with just a final little paragraph that Jeff wrote about his mother. Like I said, she thought she maybe didn't do enough. And Jeff writes, "But did I love enough, give enough, comfort enough? Were chocolates and flowers enough to show Mom I loved her and was thinking of her? I could have done more for her. Have you done enough for your mother? We get wrapped up in our own little worlds and our busy schedules, and we lose sight of our loved ones, including our mothers. I wish I had done more for my mom." God would help him free the people of Israel. I see that Jochebed put faith into her children, and we as mothers and grandmothers can also pray for faith to be poured into our children. Another song she might have sung was, I'll send an army to find you in the middle of the darkness, and when the night is through, I will rescue you. And she let Moses know that God was going to rescue the people of Israel. And we know from his story that God, Jehovah, met with him personally and said, you are the one who is going to lead the people of Israel from their captives. You are going to help rescue them. So we can put that kind of faith into our children too, to trust God no matter what, even when things are difficult. And then in 1 Samuel, we find another mother. Elkanah had 2 wives. Same situation like Rachel was faced with. He loved Hannah, though, the most. But Hannah had no children. And every year she cried and cried for children. She wanted and desired children. In fact, that other wife kept nagging her and giving her a hard time. I have 3 kids, 3 sons. I have 2 daughters. I don't know how many it was. I don't have that written here. But she would just brag about how many sons and daughters she had. In fact, every year they would go to the temple and they would bring their sacrifices to the temple, and